From turning a failed Demon Souls project into a fortune, to creating games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls, Miyazaki is the mastermind who created the Soulsborne genre. If it wasn't for Miyazaki, FromSoftware games would just be another game-developing studio with no true aim in mind. He helped shape the studio into what we know today. In an era dominated by hack-and-slash games, came Miyazaki, who restored the concept of video games. He gave his games more meaning, more in-depth story, and more freedom to the player, forcing them to learn the game, and not just speedrun it by mashing buttons. Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring would have all been average games if Miyazaki followed what everyone was doing. Instead, he gave life to his games. He gave the narration of the story to the players, to forge their own path and to learn the true beauty of the game. Miyazaki is the guy that invented a genre that was followed by 100,000 indies. From an account manager to becoming the president of the FromSoftware games, this is how Hidetaka Miyazaki became the biggest name in the gaming industry. Miyazaki grew up with a poor lifestyle in the city of Shizuoka, where he would read books all day since video games were not allowed in his home. Miyazaki would borrow as many books as he could from the library and read them, often ending up with books which were too advanced for him, and had to use his imagination to fill the gaps whenever he couldn't read the passage or understand the story. This habit of using his imagination to fill the gaps would later be one of the key factors in the success of Miyazaki. Miyazaki says, "Unlike most kids in Japan, I didn't have a dream." And so Miyazaki found himself aimlessly pursuing a degree in social science at Keio University. As Miyazaki reached his graduation, he considered joining a game development company, but ended up joining the US Oracle Corporation as an account manager to pay for his sister's tuition fees and to make a living. Miyazaki worked for the Oracle until he was 29, and that's when Miyazaki started thinking about video games again. He met up with some of his college friends who suggested Miyazaki to play a few video games, one of which was ICO. ICO was a game in which the player tried to escape a castle along with another character named Yorda. The players had to solve several puzzles, assist Yorda, and escape the enemies chasing them throughout the game. Miyazaki loved the game so much that he decided he wanted to make a game as well. In an interview with Guardian.com, Miyazaki said, "That game awoke me to the possibilities of the medium." And thus, Miyazaki started looking for a game company that would hire him. There was one problem though. At 29, Miyazaki was too old to apply for any graduate positions and also had no experience in the field to work somewhere else. Every company would refuse to take in Miyazaki, all except for one, FromSoft Games. This career change resulted in a huge drop in pay for Miyazaki, but he decided to stick with this. In 2004, Miyazaki started working as a coder for FromSoft Games, starting with Armored Core, Last Raven, and later directing Armored Core 4 and Armored Core for Answer. After his work on Armored Core, Miyazaki heard about a game that was in production somewhere else in the studio, and the team working on it was unable to create something good from it. In simple terms, the game was a failure. That game was Demon Souls, and that's when Miyazaki struck gold. Miyazaki got excited when he heard that it was a fantasy action role-playing game, and so Miyazaki wanted to take control of the production. Miyazaki could turn the game into anything he wanted, and if it still failed, it wouldn't matter because the game was already a failure. Miyazaki was assigned to Demon Souls, and he pretty much changed everything about it. He added his style to the game, a hard-to-learn weapon and armor system, and many other changes. The game initially failed on launch. It had a bad reception at the Tokyo Game Show before its release, and only sold 20,000 copies in its first week, far lower than what Sony had hoped for. But the word got around. Upon learning that the game requires skill to beat, and is not just another button-mashing game, gamers started to give it a shot. One important feature the game had was a way for players to leave custom messages for other players in the game. Players could either warn other players of the nearby dangers or trick them into death. The game was praised for this feature of implementing social mechanics into a single-player game, and soon, a community was built up around Demon Souls. More experienced players shared their experiences and guides on forums for the new player base and helped them complete the game. This led to thousands of players trying out the game, and sales soon passed 100,000. With its new success, the game found publishers willing to release it outside Japan. Demon's Souls was a success because of Miyazaki's efforts and creativity. Miyazaki started to make a name for himself. And after Demon's Souls, Miyazaki moved to Dark Souls. Dark Souls needs no introduction. It's a game that defines the Souls genre, and also is the reason that makes Souls-like games so interesting. Many games today follow the footsteps of Dark Souls and other works of Miyazaki. Games like Mortal Shell, The Surge, and even a next-gen game like Lies of P all take inspiration from Dark Souls. Miyazaki did the same with Dark Souls as he did with Demon's Souls. Players progress through a hostile dark realm as a cursed undead character who is on a journey to discover the fate of his kind. Players had to master the mechanics of the game to defeat the difficult bosses and enemies along the way before ultimately reaching the end. Dark Soul was a hit on release and outsold Demon's Soul in just a week. Miyazaki was then promoted to president of the company in 2014, and soon after, he started working on Bloodborne. In 2012, Sony approached FromSoftware for development on a new game. This new game was Bloodborne. Miyazaki began his work on the game. The story was somewhat similar to his previous titles. The players control a hunter who awakens in the plagued lands of Yharnam, where a plague is turning the citizens into beasts. Our protagonist must hunt these beasts and learn the truth behind the plague and how to end it. Just like Miyazaki in his childhood, the players had to use their imagination to fill the gaps in the story. The memory of our character is hazy, and so it is on us, the player, to discover the lore behind the game by exploring and imagining. The game had a different touch to it. Unlike Dark Souls, the game rewarded a more aggressive playstyle. With no shields and armor to play defensively, the only option left was to play on the front foot. The players had to learn a different type of fighting style from the one they were used to. The bosses had no certain attack pattern and would attack randomly, which added to the difficulty of the game. Rather than a dark realm like Dark Souls, Bloodborne had the city of Yharnam, a Victorian-era city. With arcane technology and beast-like enemies, Miyazaki made a bold move when transitioning from a fantasy game to a horror game. But that's what makes Miyazaki stand out. In an industry where most people latch on to an already successful franchise, Miyazaki chose to develop an entirely new game instead of just using the same formula that he used for Dark Souls. And his bold move paid off. Bloodborne was an instant success. Less than 2 weeks after its release, Bloodborne surpassed the 1 million sales mark, and considering the game was only released on PS4 and not other platforms, it's quite a remarkable feat. As of now, Bloodborne has sold over 7 million copies. Miyazaki had already made quite a name for himself, but obviously he didn't stop there. Miyazaki returned to the Dark Souls series as the lead director of Dark Souls 3, which was released in 2016 and was the final entry to the Dark Souls series. Dark Souls also saw the same light of fame as the previous titles. The game was commercially successful, with players deeming it the perfect end to the series. Dark Souls also had 2 DLCs, Ashes of Ariandel and The Ringed City, both of which added their own to the game. Soon after the development of Dark Souls 3, Miyazaki announced that he won't be working on any other Dark Souls game and would rather focus on other titles. Miyazaki, at this point, made a notable name for himself, not only in Japan, but internationally as well. Thousands of fans waited for the next game that Miyazaki would direct. That next game was Sekiro, Shadows Dies Twice. Sekiro is one of the most loved FromSoft games out there, and a fan favorite. The story takes place in the Sengoku period, when a war broke out between the Ashina clan and the Interior Ministry. The players control a shinobi named Wolf, who is in search of a young lord named Kuro, who has been captured by the Ashina forces for his dragon blood. The player must recover Kuro and protect him against all evils. Just like Bloodborne, Sekiro is also different from other works of Miyazaki. Unlike the other games, The player cannot make a custom character, but rather play with a specific character. The game is not only different in terms of customization, but also weapons. Throughout the game, the players can only use one weapon, a katana. The game also featured different mechanics in terms of combat, this time focusing more on parrying rather than rolling away or dodging. This set a challenge for the players to master the mechanics of parrying and timing the perfect attacks for victory. Fans loved what Miyazaki did with the game. From its beautiful world to great combat, Sekiro was a masterpiece. The game was also a fresh breath from the dark realms and cities to Japan's snowy mountains and castles. The game won the Best Action Adventure Game of the Year award in 2019 and many others. At this point, Miyazaki was already a top director and a well-respected man throughout the gaming industry. Fans waited for what Miyazaki had in mind next, as every time Miyazaki would develop something, it would be something to look forward to. FromSoftware games were already doing good with Miyazaki on board. They made games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and earned a decent amount of fame and money from them. But they were not enormous. They still needed something to make it big, a game so good that it would put FromSoftware games in the mind of every player out there. And that is where Elden Ring comes in.
Elden Ring feels like it's designed by an alien. It's so unusual, it's incredibly creative, and the art is stunning.
Elden Ring is by far Miyazaki's most popular work, and there is a good reason for it. The game is perfect in every aspect. From the great world building down to its combat, everything is perfect. The game was a collaboration with the world-famous writer George R.R. Martin, who also wrote Game of Thrones. George provided the world building for Elden Ring and wrote the backstory of the gods and demigods of the game. The game became a massive hit and a fan favorite. Players loved the game in every way possible, from its lore and combat to its detailing and dialogues. Elden Ring is the perfect Souls game. Elden Ring has sold more than 25 million copies as of now, and the sales are rapidly increasing due to the new DLC content. We will get to that later. With the success of Elden Ring, FromSoftware Games became more than just another game development studio. It became a blockbuster. From Demon's Souls to Elden Ring, every game was unique in its own way. The company was devoted to giving fans more than just a button-smashing game, but rather something they would truly enjoy. Elden Ring was far superior to the previous FromSoftware games. It is in a league of its own. The story revolves around a warrior who returns from exile to become an Elden Lord. The players must roam around the lands between to gather information about the Elden Ring, all while defeating warriors of the past and undead enemies, in hopes of restoring the ring to become the new ruler of lands between. The game has so much to do. Players can roam the world of Elden Ring and forge their own story, explore the lore of gods and other characters in the game. The game also features a variety of classes and customization to choose from, to help players make their own lore. The game received perfect scores from almost all of the major critics, and won several Game of the Year awards. Players were not even done with the game yet. Miyazaki released a major expansion for Elden Ring, entitled Shadow of the Erdtree. Shadow of Erdtree was released just recently, on June 21st, 2024, and upon arriving, it quickly rose to fame. The DLC added a whole new map to explore, new bosses, weapons, and skills, and was arguably more difficult than any other Souls game, so much so that a lot of players complained that it was too hard. But nonetheless, players started to beat the DLC and deemed it the greatest expansion in gaming. Shadow of Erdtree was expected to be good, but no one expected it to be this quality of content. Shadow of the Erdtree also beat The Witcher 3 DLC to become the highest rated DLC of all time. We live in an era where most game developers tend to add an insane amount of microtransactions to their games. And a sorry excuse for a DLC, Miyazaki is quite the opposite. No microtransactions and great DLCs are what make Miyazaki one of the greatest developers in the modern era. A lot of factors make the work of Miyazaki great, but there is one feature that stands out: the ability to fill the gaps and imagine your own story. Miyazaki left the interpretation of the story to the players, leaving a lot of gaps that needed to be filled with the player's imagination. Miyazaki took a risk when he left his IT job at Oracle for a low-paying job at FromSoftware games. But the risk was worth it. Not only did Miyazaki become one of the greatest developers ever, but he also lifted FromSoftware games from the ground to the sky. Miyazaki was also listed in the Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2023. From the failed project of Demon Souls and turning it into a top-quality game to the greatness that is Elden Ring, Miyazaki has provided us with some of the best games the industry has to offer. Games that do not just require us to sit and mash buttons, but rather interpret our own story. Learning to fill the gaps in the story and to learn the tragic tale of every enemy we kill is what made us enjoy each and every Souls game. If you enjoyed the video so far, make sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more weekly content.